So, welcome. This is another interview today with Jery Stedinger from Cornell University in a series of interviews the River Basin's Planning Operations and Management Committee is putting on, and also co-putting on with the Environmental Water Resources Systems Committee under the American Society of Civil Engineers. So, Jery, could you just start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jery Stedinger. I spent my academic career basically at Cornell, assistant associate full professor. My PhD was at Harvard, what was left of the Harvard Water Program when I was there between 73 and 77. And then something I did that's somewhat different than most of my colleagues is all my sabbaticals, except the very last one, were with federal agencies. I did two with the U.S. Geological Survey, including my first, which was key, and it sort of gave me an orientation. And then I did two with the Army Corps of Engineers, once at IWR at Fort Belvoir, which is their sort of systems policy shop. And then the other one I did in Davis with the HEC. And when I was there, I was doing some work on policy. I've been on National Research Council committee, giving them a bunch of advice. And Daryl Davis sort of said, well, now you're here, let's see if we can maybe do something with that advice. We wrote a paper on estimation of flood damages and risk and how all of that might work together. An interesting comment that I'll share was when I was at HEC in 2005, I'd been there about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and I looked around, and the people I sort of thought of as pioneers in systems analysis and systems thinking for water resources had retired. They weren't there. I'm trying to remember. Cubic was one I remembered. And of course, Leo Beard was long gone. But there were others. Well, Art, whose name I don't remember. But it was interesting the change that happened in that shop. When I talked to most of the people there, while they had civil and water resources backgrounds, they sort of introduced themselves as programmers. And we're putting out all this wonderful software, but not the intellectual version that you got 10 or 15, 20 years earlier, when people were thinking about how they were revolutionizing water resource planning, because now we had computers and software that did things. There was an evolution there, and it wasn't that they weren't continuing to revolutionize things, because Windows software and everything else was so much easier. And Gary Bruner just got one of the national awards from ASC, and he was one of the lead programmers in there. In fact, he might be what you call a transition from the older folks that viewed themselves as water resources engineers who were generating code, and the more recent generation that views themselves as code generators who also know a lot about water resources. But something that might be interesting to reflect on is very early on, I got one of the Presidential Young Investigator Awards the first year out. And at that time, you could sort of double your money if you got somebody to pay you industrial support for you to do something for them. So I ended up, because we had a Cornell PhD, the Pacific Gas and Electric Company in California, managing to get the match from them. And I worked for 4 or 5 years in the summers and bringing projects back to Cornell, working with Pacific Gas and Electric. And that was a really exciting, because one of the problems I think we have, certainly we had at that time in the 80s and into the 90s, is that except for maybe Bill Ye, I don't think a lot of the people who were building water resource system models with hydropower in it understood hydropower very much, because there's such a time of day premium of hydropower that you don't just want to say, well, there's hydropower and it has this price. Maybe in Brazil, where they've got so much hydro, they can make the price the same around the whole day, but certainly not in California and many other places that at that time the demand peaked in the afternoon. Now we have a funny situation. There's so many places, there's so much solar that in fact there's a dip in the middle. So a lot of things have changed, but at that time it was very much all thermal and hydro. PG had like 15 or 20% of their capacity was hydro. So the trick was to schedule as much of that as you could in the afternoons when the price was highest, and not have to go to gas turbines. And it was really fun. I worked with them for some years. We developed forecasting for when the snow would melt and come off, because that was a critical period for them. It just rained, well, you did what you could, but you had that big snowpack up high in California, and it was going to come off. And so When it did, could you squeeze all that through the turbines? Some places you had to worry about head. PG&E was somewhat unique. Their system was above the big reservoirs we hear about, Shasta and Oroville and Folsom. They had one facility that had 1,000 foot ahead on the turbines, and basically a small reservoir, and it went around the mountain, and then there was a pipe down the hill,
Yeah.
and went through the turbines and then into another small lake, and so they had a little bit of capacity. We were working with them on building a network flow model. It wasn't actually network flow, but the system was basically a flow model, and we had to pay a lot of attention to how much we could get on peak and off peak, and then using these small reservoirs to swap water from on to off. So because of timing, it showed up at night. You want to see if you could hold it through the day. One of my PhD students ended up working out there, and actually another one went out later. Christine and I, and before that, we had one of mine out there. So it's one of the, I don't know if people have said this, but one of the greatest ways to both transfer technology and to have it in with whether it's a federal agency or private agency is to have a PhD student go there. And Jay Lund, I think, has perfected that in California. Because he's there in Davis, and he's gotten so many people into the federal agencies, DWR, Department of Water Resources for the state in particular, that makes it very easy for him to work. We had some PhDs that went into PG&E and their systems group. I want to share one of the things I really enjoyed about PG&E, which I think is an interesting lesson. I mean, we started working on this model to describe how the whole system worked so they could optimize it. And also they had a lot of interest in scheduling preventative maintenance. You have to take the machines down fairly regularly. So the first thing they did is they had to get into the computer good specifications of how all the turbines worked and how big they were and what the tanks were. So they spent a year doing that. And like, I thought we were building an optimization model. Well, get the data right, So we did that, and then we did some other stuff, and we had to get the economics right, and then eventually we got the whole thing working, and they were very happy. Now they've sort of junked it because with deregulation, it turns out that they can't. It doesn't make sense for them to optimize over the next 12 months what's going to happen because they don't have the thermal system. And so it used to be you understood how the thermal system was working in the optimization model, and then you sort of optimize the hydro around it, and now they don't have that. But what was really fun is we were really getting the model to work. You sort of needed prices and values from one place. You needed to sort of know how the reservoirs were going to work someplace else. You went over the hydrology people, what was their model of how wet it was going to be, or they gave us different scenarios that we put in. So the model had a branching structure for the future. And then when the model ran, it generated information that all those people used. The operators used it, the people who had to buy oil, the oil for the thermal system used it. And so the model, well, I was just talking about shared vision with somebody else, which was trying to get different users of a system to work together and have a shared vision. And the people in the company weren't fighting with each other. They were all on the same team, but they still needed to communicate. And it was interesting how much of that happened through the model. You had to get all these people understanding. Some were putting in, some were taking out, some were doing both, and they had to be speaking the same language. And that was just an interesting insight to see how that model worked. A lot of times people say, well, did your model result in this being better or that being better? And well, it certainly was almost necessary, or I guess if you want to be efficient in the operating of that system and get people all the information they needed, particularly the deregulated electrical system, where if you didn't understand what your costs and values were, someone was going to take advantage of you because they were smarter. It was interesting to see how the model worked that way. So I always liked to use stochastic hydrology, particularly in those days, and they would rather just use different historical sequences of precipitation and run them through a rainfall runoff model, and then somehow try to exaggerate the variance to make up for the fact that the R squared for that nonlinear model wasn't one. But that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed working with a lot of people in different parts of the company. We were very effective, and I think in giving them a model that helped them understand their system. And of course, an amazing part of these models, like did have an optimization engine, and we did pay attention to that and worked well. But a lot of it is just accounting. You got so much water here and so much water there, and somebody's taking out here for Cullum Irrigation District or Tuolumne Irrigation District, and you got to meet a certain amount of flow there. And I remember once I was in a meeting and we had a lot of models we'd been publishing over the years about how to run a hydro system. And there was some smaller water basin that they had, and they had this wonderful optimization going, and it was doing a lot of things. I said, wow, this is great. Did you come up with all this for yourself, or certain papers you looked at, or academics you talked to who've been doing this? They said, well, we talked the boss into putting all this telemetry in. So we were getting all this data on what the flows were and what was going on here and there. And it used to be, we didn't know. I mean, the GS would go out once a week or something and look at what the recorder said. But now it was coming in, and the boss said, okay, guys, we spent all this money on this telemetry. What are you going to do with it? So they were forced to build a model to justify the money they'd spent on instrumentation. But of course, without the instrumentation, they couldn't build a fairly short-term model. They were thinking about a week or less because of the smaller system. But that was interesting. It was interesting to see how first we were talking to ourselves in some sense as academics. What would a model look like? How would we do it? And get some data. Even when I was working with the Bureau and PG, those things were. The Bureau was always on a month and time step, sometimes down to a week. PG&E, we were basically running with a weekly time step that had different hours of the day in it. So it had on-peak weekdays, off-peak weekdays, weekend on-peak, weekend off-peak, and then we had sort of fudged how many transitions there were from on-peak to off-peak and how big the reservoirs were that could do that regulation. So we were basically modeling at that time scale in an aggregate way. But it was fun. That was very positive within that company trying to work together. They paid us to help them with modeling California system, basically the Central Valley project, which was a Bureau project. And they exchanged electricity with Shasta in particular, but basically with the feds. The feds were supposed to basically give the power they generated to federal agencies and installations or state ones. But there's this shaping problem. But Shasta is a big reservoir and a big hydro, and so you really want to peak that to earn money. But that was not the shape that best benefited the federal facilities where people went home at night and they could only use so much during the day. So we spent a lot of time on negotiations. And there was a CV power model that they had. There was a simulation model, and it was cute. It had rule curves. I mean, they were simulating the historical record, which they adjusted for withdrawals because irrigation had changed. So they put the water back into the historical record, then we took it out and we simulated. But to get through 27 and 1930, they had rule curves that basically said what to do because they didn't have a simple rule that would get them through those years. I said, this is cheating. I mean, it's not clear it's smart because if you're taking the historical flows and developing them for 2020 or 2025, is your rule curve that got you through 1930 that you were using in 1960 going to be the right fudge factors? And so we sort of used the space rule that came right out of Moss et al. And build some other heuristics that said, if we look at what's going on and we try to leave space in the reservoirs proportional to what the inflow is likely to be, the expected inflow, so that we can capture it. And so we built a little optimization model in there that was basically trying to balance the water. And then we sort of had a quadratic representation of penalties of the space rule and how to balance. And it turned out it not only got through the bad years of record, it did better. It cheating rule because it was a little smarter, not very smart, but a little smarter. So that was a wonderful experience. And we felt gave them a simulation model that was more realistic and more flexible. It was interesting. There was this debate about, well, you want to build optimization models, so you want to build simulation models. Eckert did ATC, like, I gotta simulate, you can't get enough reality into the optimization models. In some sense, that was true, but it turned out I thought that was a wrong argument because we kept putting optimization models in simulation models. You had a complex system with lots of things going on, and you want to balance all that. I mean, if you try to make just a heuristic to do that, it didn't make sense. And so that was our first one, CV Power, and that worked very well. And then in some sense, PG&E, it was like a simulation model. It was an optimization model because there was so much going on. Anyway, those were the debates we used to argue about, and it was interesting. I was up at a Canadian utility, I think it was in Manitoba, and it was interesting how they got into optimization. They had somebody who went to the university and took a course and then was an operator. But as a kid, he lived there, so he knew the system, the reservoirs. I mean, he swam in them and dove, and so with him trying to build an optimization model, being in the operating pool, but also I don't know what the term is for a local Canadian, but it was interesting how he did that. Now we don't seem to have those problems. I think everybody has a kid that's pushing them to be more computer literate, and we see lots of good things going on. And my colleague Pat Reed, he wants to use genetic algorithm kinds of things to universal fitting functions that they can use to operate the reservoirs in Vietnam or someplace else, which is an interesting way to go. I tried to use stochastic dynamic programming for years. BC Hydro doesn't use stochastic dynamic programming. They don't have a complex system, but they have some bigger ones for their system. And they early on got a stochastic dynamic programming model going that helped them operate that one. So when I was consulting for them, we talked about stochastic dynamic programming. And then I went down and talked to BPA, like, no, you use stochastic dynamic programming. They were used to deterministic models. So we were helping them branching trees into their deterministic models, so it had some feeling of uncertainty in it. It seems amazing how robust these things are, that if you're paying attention and correcting when things get out of line, it's not as critical to figure out the uncertainty as much. We had a project for a small reservoir up in New Hampshire, and we were trying to do a real good job of uncertainty. And it turned out what drove that model was the price of power in Boston. If power values peaked in Boston, you just ran the turbines flat out because they didn't have real big constraints on maintaining minimum flows or water supply or irrigation. They wanted to make money. And if prices were low in Boston, you try to store as much water as you could. So often systems have their trick. What is it we're really doing here? Are we storing water for irrigation and trying to then shape the releases so as to get the most value? Or in that case, it was not many people are counting on us for reliability or water. What we want to do is make money. So when the price is high, we sell, and when the price is low, we hold back. And that was a fun project. And that was one where we were doing stochastic dynamic programming, and forecasts were valuable, but they had to be at the right scale. Somebody gave you a monthly forecast. It's like, what am I going to do with that? I'm trying to figure out how much power to generate in the next 6 to 10 hours. And even if they gave you a forecast for a week, it's the same sort of thing. But if they could tell you exactly what's going to happen in the next 48 hours, that's what we wanted to know.
This has
Deregulation had a big deal. I ended up doing a certain amount of consulting in New England, because with the deregulation, it wasn't like they were selling the power to themselves in the way they used to, where if you had the internal price wrong, you earned money in one pocket and lost it from the other. It was your pocket and somebody else's pocket. So there was a big push to make sure they had optimization models that were tuned right. They didn't get taken.
This has been really fabulous, Jery. First of all, I want to introduce myself. I'm David Rosenberg at Utah State University.
I'm sorry, I didn't give you a chance to talk.
No, I mean, this has been great. I just want to reflect back a few things that you said, and then I'll continue. But you mentioned your sabbatical at the Hydrologic Engineering Center in Davis, California, around 2005. And I was a master's student working under Jay Lund was my advisor, but I also had an internship at HCC. I was working with Beth Faber and Chris Dunn, and we were kind of getting the HEC Res Sim model up and going. We were testing it with, 40 different watersheds in the Central Valley. And that, like you described, that was just kind of really an age where the software was coming into existence, because the prior software, like HEC 5, was cards, like punch cards, and then they moved it into a text file, but it was still, you had to have a punch file mentality to understand how the input data worked for those models. And the hydro peaking issue, I'm working at Glen Canyon Dam now, and that's a really interesting issue of the hydro peaking, because downstream there's aquatic invertebrates, and they lay their eggs, they lay and hatch their eggs at the high water mark, right? But every day the water level drops and their eggs get desiccated. And so that you have trouble producing enough having enough population and diversity of populations to be the food for the endangered national native fish of the Grand Canyon. And so there's kind of, I mean, these ideas are woven, really into a lot of different systems.
Let me tell you just a brief story for that. We were doing a project for New York City, New York State, on water supply for the city. And they have 3 big reservoirs, or maybe 4, count, but how you count, in the upper Delaware. And then there's a flow constraint they have to meet in times of drought in the Delaware. Can you do any better? So we did our thing. We had the whole reservoir system we were playing around with, and we were just generating rules that would, on how they would operate and balance the reservoirs. And we showed it to the guy from the States. Wow, look how we're doing. He said, damn it, you've dried up that stream. That's one of the famous drought streams in upstate New York. You can't do that. You didn't tell us that.
We didn't know to put it in the model.
Dan Shear sort of said you discover constraints and objectives when you violate them.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of those that you don't realize, particularly when you interview people or talk to them. It's they don't think to tell you things like that because it never occurred to them you would do such a dastardly thing, and you don't know any better.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. You really have to ask open-ended questions to really find out what the constraints are, the objectives. And you also mentioned getting people together, and that's what we're finding for a new Colorado River Collaborate project. I mean, the reservoir levels are going down, the basins aridifying, the stream flow is going down. What we're seeing now as the core issue is getting people to actually talk with each other and trust each other and get in a place where they can start creatively problem solving. And I mean, that seems to be a huge issue. Why did you get into water systems work?
This may be a little embarrassing. My father was a ham radio operator and had a lot of electricity, and I went to college thinking I was going to be an electrical engineer, and I did that for 2 years. It's like, oh, I just keep solving the same problem over and over again. And it didn't seem of high social value either. And so I actually switched out of engineering and got my Bachelor of Science at UC Berkeley in Applied Math because I really enjoyed mathematics. I always had. Didn't imagine you could do it for a career. I felt it had a lot of power. But I did take an operations research course, which was my way of searching for how I could apply my mathematical skills in the real world. And then I applied for graduate school at Harvard and got in with a fellowship. It was in the applied math program, but I was looking around with what I could do with my mathematical skills. They had the remnants of the Harvard water program, Harold Thomas and Mike Fearing, Joseph Harrington, and sort of went over there and said, gee, I'm a mathematician, but I really love to deal with these environmental problems. And Fearing and Thomas have been very big on developing stochastic models of things, but the whole Harvard water program gave them a real interest in larger reservoir systems. And water quality was lurking in the corners. And after getting a master's degree in applied math, Fearing came back from sabbatical and was willing to take me on. He sort of said, well, at the moment, I've got 2 funded projects. One is burn patients in hospitals and how to manage them as they go through the different stages. I said, I hate hospitals. I hate medicine. I hate blood. No, please don't. And he said, well, the other one is I was working with C.S. Holling on my sabbatical at IASA in Austria, and we were working on managing a pest in the forest, Maine and New Brunswick. And I said, oh, I was a Boy Scout. I love forests. Insects are fine. Trees are wonderful. So that was actually my PhD, which was great. And then I was fortunate to get the position at Cornell in the Water Sources Group with Pete Laux and Christine Shoemaker. And Doug Haith is in another department. So it was wonderful. I don't think you find many systems groups that have 4 capable people like that. That made for a wonderful career. Have an opportunity to get into more stochastic hydrology, which originally what I was doing at PG&E. We developed a stochastic streamflow model for them that they could drive the simulation model and that forecasting runoff. And then that moved into developing scenarios, trees that would go in their model their system, and we spent a lot of time talking about how to disaggregate the system so that we could model it. You try and do everything at once, or you break it down by river system, which we could do. That's how I got into it. A lot of mathematics and trying to find a place that would be useful. First, it was insects and trees, and then it was generating water, and that went into modeling reservoir systems. So did that PG&E. We got some contracts in the state where we did different things. Had students who worked on stochastic dynamic programming, which I guess was never a big success, but we were on the boundaries. we got a nice application with PG&E and some others. Faber, who you said you worked with out at HEC, she got a PhD here at Cornell and did sampling stochastic dynamic programming, which was very promising. And then Jonathan Logomontagne also worked with sampling stochastic dynamic programming, as well as the big model for the Columbia system. But we had a contract with them to try and generate sort of scenario trees that they could use, which is a way of taking a deterministic model and making it sort of feel the edges. I mean, it's it's like a highway. You hate to build a model that's where it thinks it can drive a half an inch from the guardrail and nothing ever is going to go wrong. You're not going to get you're not going to get have a dry couple of weeks. We could get sort of scenarios in there, high and low, not a huge amount of resolution necessarily, but enough for the model to think it wanted to keep some elbow room, because with that feedback we found that generally if you had a little bit of elbow room, it could adjust as it went and do okay.
Since we started, you've answered probably 6 of my other questions with just these 2. You've talked about a lot of successful projects. Could you maybe think of one that was unsuccessful and talk about why it was unsuccessful?
Well, to be absolutely truthful, I'm not a guy who spent a lot of time working on real projects. I always admired Jay Lund, who did that so well all the time. And Palmer was also one who was getting involved. Jay could do it because he lived in Sacramento and was working on the California system, so he was in the same place as all the decision makers. Palmer traveled a lot, and so did Pete. I was very conscientious about my teaching and often had larger classes and never quite figured out how Pete pulled it off, except with the smaller classes, he can reschedule them. And it's hard to do that with 50 students in a class or more. I don't know that I signed many contracts where we had to deliver a product. Oftentimes, we were working on either statistical issues or dynamic programming where we had information for a real system, and then sort of played with it at home and didn't have a contract to deliver. So I don't think I skirted that close to failure. I remember work we did with TVA on some generating stochastic flows, but we could do that. And we had the MN projects with the city, again, it's not that far, and the city's not that far. I don't remember any things that were incredible failures. I mean, if there was a failure, it was when they deregulated in California, the models we built weren't meant for that new environment. That was not what we envisioned. And so they fairly quickly, I think, were replaced by models that focus more on spinning reserve and things. That also reflects, there's so much renewable in the system now, and we need backup for that. Yeah. And we used to worry about a steam plant blowing a pipe and going down. Now you're worried about the wind not showing up, and that's a lot of power you lose rather quickly. Hydro, where they used to think so much of it as a peaking source. The sun shines when we used to have peaks, and the photovoltaics come on. So hydro has a much bigger value now as reserve, spinning reserve, because you need to have that someplace. And you don't like to build thermal plants to sit around not do anything, so you have reserve. So you see more and more hydro doing that. And one that really surprised me is if you're in California, you have big pumps to go over the Hatch piece. They get water to the southern part and stuff. And we saw that in the Columbia too. You have big pumps. Well, a pumping is like spinning reserve, because you can stop pumping and you free up all that energy.
Yeah.
So you don't think about that, but it's, if it's pumping, you can shut it down. That frees up power that you can use to cover whatever you lost. It may be that you lost wind and then it gets covered with solar or something.
Yeah.
Systems have gotten much more complicated, and the intermittency and less than perfect reliability of the renewables is really making the utilities sweat.
Yeah, that's something we're seeing at Glen Canyon Dam. They're switching from, they used to sell this cheap energy to their customers, but now that the reservoir levels are going down, they're generating less energy, and they're pushing the costs onto the customer. The customers now have to go out on the market and buy energy that they used to be able to get from the Western Area Power Authority. And, hydro is becoming more of a backup or having spinning reserve, as you said. Yeah, there's a transition definitely in place. Where do you see our field going in the next 5, 10, 15, or 20 years?
Well, I'd like to say, what do you mean by our field?
Systems analysis, water resources, river basin management.
Well, one of the neat things is we don't sit around and wonder if we're relevant and we're going to be able to build models that they're useful for people. I think a lot of utilities wouldn't imagine trying to get by without them. They're part of the system. I don't know. An interesting one for me and is there's this generation of people that have come along now that are all into evolutionary algorithms, and I'll share with you that I worry at night about the fact that when you talk to them, they sort of, we used to sit around and say, okay, what's the structure of the best policy going to be? If I've got heuristics, what does it have to be sensitive to? How can I decompose this policy? And I hear them say, well, we'll just have a universal interpreter and let the genetic algorithms grind away and it'll find the right thing. And seeing a bunch of people doing that, and I just remember the day they had one model and then they made it a more sophisticated universal interpreter, gave it more parameters. And I pointed out to them that they're actually doing worse than they used to do, which sort of seemed like not the right outcome that you would expect. But I would like to think that if you married trying to use as much physical and economic understanding that you could bring to the system, and then let the evolutionary algorithms sort of optimize the policy the way they do, but don't go with a universal interpolator. Go with one that you think has a structure that's trying to do the right thing in the first place. And then you have coefficients for balancing or how to use forecasts or something. And now that's a very low level vision of where our field could go, which is having policies or rules or something, objective functions that you're going to let drive an optimization algorithm that makes everything balance. And then using, if you can't optimize them with the old quadratic optimization algorithms we had, that you can use the evolutionary ones. But in a bigger sense, one would like to argue that maybe we're successful and there aren't going to be any big breakthroughs in the traditional places. On the other hand, I think the systems are getting more and more complicated. We want to be more efficient, so we don't have as much extra stuff sitting around, and we're bringing on stuff that's less reliable than it used to be. And if that doesn't worry us enough, we have terrorists trying to break in and make it so systems don't work. So I think there's a lot more push to do a lot better for lots of users. I was looking out in the West, and the Native Americans and First Nation, I think is the term that gets used. They want more, and the recreation wants more, and hydropower has contracts that were signed that we can't meet. It's tough, and I've heard you talk about some of your work is trying to get all those people together and say, okay, there's going to be a lot of pain here. How can we somehow do that in the best way? Before we started, you were talking about our paper on reliability, resiliency, vulnerability, and vulnerability is a wonderful idea. How bad can things get, and can we set things up so that we're not vulnerable to have those really bad outcomes? And if you don't plant cotton one year, I don't think it's a big deal. If the almond trees die, you're out of production for a while. So yeah. If you just allocate a certain percentage of what people had before to everybody, and you don't have a water market to get some of that water to the almond trees, it's not good. And of course, fish don't necessarily have good people representing them, but we've gotten more sensitive to that too. I hope in the right ways. I know some of the water quality modelers have, I think, made good advances in trying to understand what's going on and where you were talking about breeding and high water levels. And those are real concerns. One of the things that always disappointed me is that, we have minimum flows to protect the environment. Well, the minimum flow that works in the winter when things are cold, metabolisms are slow of both animals and plants, may not be enough water in the summer when it's hot. And I haven't seen, but we're very sensitive to getting really super sophisticated and trying to think about how do we release water in such a way that use less water to support the environment, but we use it in an intelligent way. So actually, it's more beneficial for environment that we have the water with the right temperature there at the right time. And of course, they've done a lot now for multiple intakes on reservoirs so that they can pull cold water out or warmer water near the surface so as to pay attention to what happens downstream. The other one I've seen is, you start all of a sudden dump a lot of water in the stream as it comes from deeper where it's cold, and the poor fish that was barely making it because it was so hot suddenly thinks you put them in the freezer, and and the thermal shock can, I understand, be tough on some organisms. So, but we have better data, and as better data comes in, people want to see us make better use of it, and that requires modeling that understands how temperatures change in the stream and where the water goes and what happens. And I certainly expect that we're going to do better in those areas, as well as trying to deal with the reliability issues with the mix of resources we have. And I didn't mention, but you have more people generating their own power too, either behind the meter or contributing to the system. And that's a real headache for utilities because they can't control that.
Yeah, whether they encourage that or just kind of go along with the flow, so to speak. And I mean, we face that here in Logan, Utah, that people are putting on solar, and that's an added source. How much, and some people generate more solar than they can use, and how do you sell that back to the system, to the utility? And does the utility want to buy that at a, they obviously want to buy it at a lower price than what their other alternative sources are.
Yeah, in the Columbia, BPA had a real interesting one. They had to sign contracts that they would take wind generation, so that way wind generators felt comfortable signing contracts to build these things.
Right.
Then they get periods where it's gotten hot, the snow's melting, they've got all this water coming down the stream. They want to generate hydro, but there's only so much demand, and they have to take the wind, and so they end up spilling water that they could use to generate power because they have to pay for the wind generation because they've got a contract that says they have to take it if it's generated. So I would like to think that's a transition problem that we have. Those contracts were part to support a transition, but those are things we need to work out too. I mean, who dumps energy? Do the wind turbines dump energy? Does the dams dump water? Because sometimes you can't use it.
Right.
Or maybe we can package it. Can you come up with a little can that will hold power?
Batteries. I mean, there's a lot of technology trying. I mean, essentially it's a battery, right? But we're not very, or maybe there's a lot of room for improvement there on the electrical engineering side.
Pump storage is another kind of battery that was very successful. There's a certain limit to how much of that's around, but for large dams, they could pump water back up into the reservoir.
Yeah.
And certainly there are lots of pump storage facilities that were designed for that.
Well, with the pump storage, though, I mean, it's profitable because you're pumping at the time of the day when the energy price is low, but you're releasing it when the price is high, but you're still losing energy each in both directions, right? I mean,
but power prices can change by a factor of 2 or 3.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Particularly if there's a problem, and 2 to 1 was not unusual from night to day.
Sure.
So there's a lot of room there to play with the market.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said it's a profitable enterprise, but it's maybe not energy. You don't generate energy like on the net or in the. Could you share your thoughts on kind of moving to a non-stationary world? Like, how do we go about doing that? Like when a lot of stochastic hydrology is premised on statistical properties, probabilities, reliability, resilience, vulnerability, or robustness. How do you see that work kind of evolving as, the future doesn't necessarily hold the same statistical properties as the past?
It's an excellent question, and I as I do stochastic hydrology and flood frequency, I always say And for you young folks out here, here's your problem that I'm leaving you.
Okay.
But there's another conflict is we try to be more efficient and we build these optimization models and we fine tune the system. One of the things we do is we take the slack out of it. Fat. It's this is that. You don't need that safety margin. Well, yeah, if the world changes, that safety margin is what was going to save me. And same thing when you're promising power and water for irrigation and for recreation and fish, and you're stretching the system to supply all these things. Then the world changes. Now, there's one good thing that as climate changes, some places it's going to get better, and some places it's going to get worse. So, we will see, I assume, in the Great Plains region, as things heat up, that crops can move farther north and there'll be places under cultivation that weren't before, provided they have water. But that's sort of the heat is there, and hopefully be able to have water for some things. They're trying to raise crops that are more water efficient, or irrigate in ways that are more water efficient. The variability in the world is a challenge. Two thoughts. One is some places it's going to get better. We should move there. And the other is we didn't know really what the world was like before. I mean, our records are often not that long. And so we wrote a paper from here to where with the ideas like, where are we now? If you've got a 30-year, 40-year record of stream flows, it's not like you know what the 100-year drought is. So zero is always a lower bound. It's sometimes I think we get over upset about climate change because we don't realize how much uncertainty we had before. But clearly, if you're a coastal community, there's a reason to be concerned. I actually got involved in a project on the Hudson, and this was cute. They dredge, I've forgotten the number, I think it's 24 feet for the turning basin up in Albany. And they were concerned about what was going to happen if we had climate change and sea level rose 2 feet, and what was going to happen in Albany and everything else. And well, they dredge to 24 feet. If the ocean goes up 2 feet, they'll still dredge to 24 feet. And I'm not sure 24 was the number. It was 24 or 18 or something like that. But it was interesting to think about how many things we do will adapt rather naturally to climate change. And the Hudson is a drowned river basin that the sides are relatively steep. So it turns out Amtrak's in trouble because their tracks are down close to the river. But for the most part, most other property is farther up. And so even though you think that that's sort of coastal, they're okay. Manhattan is right down there on the water, particularly Wall Street. And when I see them trying to make plans, it starts to look like Venice. And I don't see how they're going to solve that problem other than, how do you retreat? And then they have all the subways, which got really killed in Sandy because they no plans to sort of close up the subways so water wouldn't get into them. Just open stairways for people to walk down and grates for ventilation. Maybe they can rethink that, but it's not clear if you want to be down the subway when they put something over the grate so there's 2 feet of water up there that wants to come down and join you. So I guess what they do is they close the subways when that gets to
Final two questions. First, what advice would you give or do you give to people who are starting out in the systems analysis, river basin planning and management field?
Well, I think Pete wrote this wonderful book that you no doubt has shown around. I think it's a very exciting field. One of the things I've really loved about it, it's like when we're working at P&G, I'm working at PG&E, we're trying to build this model. I get to go around and ask people questions, Oh, hi there. So I understand you're in what department? Oh, that department. Okay. What do you do that you expect this model to do for you? Or are you ready to provide this sort of information? And you talk to them. And so you go down to operations, you go over to accounting, you go to buying energy and ordering oil. And because in systems, one of the fun things we do is we try to pull things together, right? We don't just sit there and say the world's a small box and my responsibility is to do this little thing. We're trying to think about maybe how we could reorganize that whole system in some way to drive things in a different way, use of different combinations of opportunities. And I always enjoyed that. I guess maybe that system thinking, that we don't think of the world as a little box that we're stuck in. This is not a water resources issue, but I remember talking to one of our accountants who said, we don't need managers. I know how to do my job. Like, okay, woman, you clearly have a very limited view of what's going on because you know your job as your job was defined, But then if somebody tries to reorganize the system, we have a new software that handles accounts differently. We have a new structure in terms of how accounting gets done in departments and colleges and university. And I think it's exactly the same way in the real world in the water resources areas. We have new demands coming on for what we want to provide. We used to have a fishery, but the fisheries died, but now we have more recreation, we have more renewable energy, and they need a different kind of water or a different kind of this. Or I remember I was working, a contract with TVA, and they were operating their reservoirs to make sure they had cooling water in front of the nuclear plants, because they had to have cold enough water to cool the nuclear plants, or else they had to turn on the cooling towers, which chewed up 10 or 15% of the power that the plant was generating. So that's a big hit. And they had the ability to get water from different areas of the reservoir, so they could get colder water when they need it. But if they didn't need colder water, they didn't want to waste the colder water, because you want to save that for when you need to keep the stream cool enough for the nuclear plant. So systems is fun. The world will continue to evolve. Early on, I had a very interesting talk I went to where a Corps of Engineers guy who had this bee in his bonnet about how people were accusing the Corps of having done economics to justify projects, and that the projects weren't justifiable. And he went back and reanalyzed the costs and benefits of a bunch of these projects and showed they were cost effective and everything was great. But the benefits and costs weren't what they thought they were going to be. Okay, great. You really have no idea what you're doing, but it worked out all right. And so that gets back to sort of this robustness. One of the nice things about reservoirs is it's so easy to reoperate them to provide water at different times. You're not locked in. And you can reallocate between flood control and other sorts of things. And we're getting smarter with flood control. Beth Faber out there at HEC is sort of saying, why do we have a fixed flood control pool that we use every year, even when we're in a drought? And if there's a huge snowpack in the mountains, maybe we ought to make a little bigger flood control pool. But when they built the reservoir, they said, okay, farmer gets so much capacity. The flood control for Sacramento has so much capacity, and everybody's jealous of their stuff. You mentioned trust. Can we come up with a rule that says, look, when it's a real wet out here, we don't have to have as much conservation pool, because we're sure we're going to get runoff, but we're worried about floods. And that kind of skill is going to improve as we understand the weather. So we ought to be able to do that better and not dump water to keep the flood control open when we may need it later. I guess that's what I would say. It's a fun job. It's exciting. It's for people who want to be nosy and talk to people and try to develop connections so that we can understand how we can make everybody happier.
I mean, systems analysis is an integrative science as opposed to a reductionist science. Yeah, that's one of the things I really love about our field and my work. You just get to talk to people and listen and hear kind of where they're at, and then try and stitch it together. And that's something we're doing now and want to do more of in the Colorado River Basin, which is really facing some tough times. So my last question is, anything else you want to share that we didn't talk about?
Well, you mentioned trust and faith that you know what you're doing. We did have one that was embarrassing. We were working on a contract with the U.S. Geological Survey. It was a statistical issue, and the student discovered that something hadn't gotten done right. So, what do you do? Well, they probably won't spot it if we don't mention it. But we immediately mentioned it. It's like, you want to be an honest broker because you're controlling information. You want to do your results as reliably as you can. I like to say, I think most models, big models, are probably wrong. People have got some things in there that aren't right. We need to be modest, humble about whether or not our models are right, our data is right. I think a future thing that I should have mentioned earlier is I remember when Dave Dowdy was challenging the Corps with citizen science. He had a bunch of citizens out there gathering data. They could afford instruments, and they had laptop microcomputers at that point that could run the heck programs. I mean, there was a time when we had the prophets at HEC in the Corps that could have big computers and data sets and knew how to run some of these programs. And now Citizens can do that. And so they can see what you're doing. And you run them on your phone. Yeah, somebody told me that an iPhone is better than the biggest computer we had in 1995. I think there's a distributed information and computing that's going to really have an interesting impact on things. You just can't say, well, the Corps did it. They've done it to me. We're the Corps. We know what we're doing. You should trust us. And you talk to them a while and you find out they don't know what they're doing. And being humble would help them out. Shouldn't pick on an agency I had 2 sabbaticals with. But anyway, I'm currently working with them again, and they're reinforcing some stereotypes. Yeah, how do we do systems analysis when everybody can participate, or do we want to encourage that kind of participation? Do we want to put our data sets and our models out there? And you're a one to talk to about putting our models out there because of your reproducibility idea that you ought to make things so people could use them. And that's a wonderful thought. Another lesson from my career, and this is on the statistical side. If you put a paper out with a complex analysis that people have to do for statistics, and it's not that complex compared to operating a reservoir system, but it's more than somebody can do in a day or two. Most people aren't going to do it. It's not just reproducibility. It's if you've got a significant kind of analysis that you're providing the world, if you can provide the software that does that, then people will do it. Express some frustration with federal agencies here. We published in 2018 the new Bulletin 17C for flood frequency analysis. Well, I discovered last February that there was a significant error in that code. And I haven't got them to fix it yet because they can't quite agree on how to do it. And I told them how to do it, but it's like, well, why should we believe you? I mean, you were only an author of Bulletin 17C. But it confirmed my sense that models are complicated models are going to have errors in them. You just don't get everything right. So you ought to build models with that understanding that you need to keep checking them. And the error that you have in there may not have shown up yet. It's because that option has not been enforced. The code didn't go that way. So we need to be humble. We need to be ready for citizens to get involved. I think some people would say, Rick Palmer probably, Dan Shear, that we would be wise to focus on enabling the public as opposed to hoping they leave us alone.
Definitely, I agree. I mean, the whole result reproducibility theme of my work is trying to get people to muddle and muck in your work, right? And to play around in it, to find out where it's not working, to improve on it, to just make stuff available and easier for people to pick up. Like I think, a PhD student or a master's student spends 2 or 3 years developing an analysis technique or an algorithm and writing the code to do it. And then someone else should be able to pick it up and do it in a day or an hour or 2 hours, right? That there shouldn't have to take as long as what it took the originators to do.
And hopefully it's right. There's a much better chance that the PhD student who's been playing around with that for 2 years has got a code that's right, where if somebody just goes and tries to do it themselves, in a hurry, are they going to get all that right? So anyway, there's a vision there of if you have a product you want the world to be able to use, can you stop when you got it published? And unless you're paying attention to reproducibility and putting it in a code that people can pick up and use, you haven't probably gotten into a forum. Now, one of the things I really benefit from is it's nice if an agency, federal agency, will pick it up and supply it.
Definitely.
And I found out the best way to get it from my research to the federal agency is have a PhD student go work for them.
I think Beth Faber would be a great example of that.
Beth Faber and Tim Cohn and Andrea Vayu, I've had a couple students do that, and it really works well. They get a permanent job. Unfortunately, it's not a faculty position from their point of view sometimes.
Right.
But Beth didn't want one. Beth got her dream job. She wanted to do something like HEC, and there she is. And Tim Cohn went to the USGS and did flood frequency, and that worked out incredibly well. Jan Greiger went to PG&E. Rich Vogel and I are competing with who can get the most students in the U.S. Geological Survey.
Who's going to optimize that problem? Jery, this has just been fantastic. I really want to thank you for spending more than an hour talking about, the past and the future and kind of what's fun. And hopefully this can inspire people to join our field and to keep doing great stuff.
And new things that we haven't talked about.
Yeah.
And I think when you said what the future's like, I tend to look at the things we've been doing. There are new problems, whether it's communication or fire in the West
Mhm.
or who knows what.
Trust.
And we need some bright people to help make the system work.